2004, Facebook didn't exist. Twitter was still a sound, and cloud was still in the sky. 4G was still a parking place. LinkedIn was a prison. Applications were what you sent to colleges, and Skype was actually a typo. All this was said in a New York Times column by columnist Thomas Friedman. Now, individuals and companies are adopting technology at an increasing speed each year. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Analytics Inside podcast. This is Priya Dialani, your host for today. While just about every business is shifting in some shape or form, the regulatory compliance industry is also undergoing a revolution. Keeping pace with legislative changes, consumer behavior, and technological advancements has become very challenging. Even compliance professionals must be aware of emerging technologies that apply enterprise wide as well as compliance function. Now, compliance programs should analyze the potential risk and rewards of new and emerging technologies to appropriately guide companies in ethical decision making. However, as technology is penetrating in each aspect of lives, can it have its implications on regulations and compliance as well? So let's get our answers today with Josh Jackson, Executive Director of the AI Association and Global Head of Government and Public Services at 6clicks. Hi, Josh. How are you doing?
Good. How are you, Priya?
I'm doing good. Thank you so much. Okay, so let's start with knowing about the company. So, can you tell us about what 6clicks is? Seems like a pretty interesting name. What is the specialization or the services that it offers?
Yeah, thanks. 6clicks, it is an interesting name. And I think when we talk about regulations, when we talk about compliance, it seems so complicated and so boring. And with 6clicks, the thought was, and I didn't come up with a name, but some of the founders were in a room and noticed that most compliance software is hard to use, and regulations are hard to get right, and visually it's cumbersome. And so with 6clicks, the thought was, can we do everything that we want to do with compliance and risk management and governance to do that in 6clicks or less? So the thought was to make it as easy to use with very few clicks throughout the screen. So running an assessment or the like. So we're really around being that GRC, the integrated security management system or information security management system, all under one platform, using artificial intelligence and using the skills in everything at our disposal, the emerging tech at under one platform.
Sounds quite interesting, George. Thank you for letting us know about what the company is. And yes, definitely, I agree that regulations and compliance are pretty complicated and tend to be boring as well. Similarly, it becomes very daunting for organizations to comply with each regulations and make sure everything is under control. But what is being as of now going around is that should organizations be worried about both the whispers as well as the actions supporting the desire to regulate AI? Well, some people or some experts say yes. So the longer is that although standards are not like a sexy stuff, they are critical for making AI not only more useful but also safe for consumer use. Now, given that AI is still young, probably in this field of regulatory and compliance, but it is quickly being integrated in every application that impacts our lives. There is no consensus on what standards should be established. So, can you tell us about with what mission the company was built upon, or can you tell us about your journey also since the inception of the company?
Yeah, so there's a lot of questions in there, and I'll try to unpack them as best I can. In terms of regulation of artificial intelligence, that's a very, very interesting question, and I think one of the biggest challenges and there have been Nobel Prizes in economics won off some of these concepts around regulations within the current field of the economy, how the economy has been working. Regulations help propel a lot of new businesses and a lot of new technology. And being able to keep those regulations flowing with innovation is only going to help innovation grow. Simultaneously, I think that we have all put in regulations across the globe that are not keeping up with the innovation. So the innovation could be even more propelled if the legal framework and the regulatory framework was modernized, and you had some modernization of the laws and the governance around the technology, or in this case, the intelligence. So that's one. The second was my journey through this was actually coming from the legal side of things and noticing that the law was not keeping up, but there was this new understanding of how computing power came about, and more computing power, more and more development within telecommunications, Internet of Things, to cybersecurity, as well as natural language processing, computer vision, and the like. And we didn't really have any answers from the legal side. And companies were not using the technology to really look at regulations and laws and policies as efficiently. So I started probably 5 years ago training artificial neural networks to take a look at companies and what they think their risks are and what regulations potentially could be impacting their business, and saying this regulation meets their business unit, and using the technology to sift through hundreds of thousands of documents to make sure that they were keeping up with particular regulations. With 6clicks, we really looked at, okay, cybersecurity is so complex, and if we need to protect certain pieces of information, what are the appropriate controls that need to be put in place? And what controls do we already have? And it just makes it so much easier to use artificial intelligence, to use a system that is driven in alignment with your controls and with the regulations, rather than trying to piece together this email, dust off this binder that's on your desk, and use this spreadsheet to track all the information or assets, and then determine what route we want to take to patch some of these holes or mitigate some of the risks within the system. Why don't we just do it under an entire enclave, or in this case, an entire platform that can manage all of that, manage the supply chain? And that was very exciting, and it's very appealing, because those that are trying to breach systems are definitely using technology and particular complicated vectors to penetrate the system. Why are we as companies still using spreadsheets and Word documents to place the appropriate controls and track the systems and assets that we want to track and keep protected? I think that's all your questions, all wrapped up into one.
Yes, it definitely does, and sounds very exciting when you're talking about using technologies like natural language processing, artificial intelligence. So it seems how we're heading towards in the field of regulatory and compliance, and how technology can also play a role in such things. Because you haven't come across any such thing, or probably read that how these technologies can be helpful in framing around regulations and policies. So it's quite fascinating to listen to such journey and your contributions as well.
Thanks. Thanks.
Great. So earlier, of course, we have discussed that yes, regulations and compliance are complicated. But how do you think, or probably if you can tell us, how technology, for example, artificial intelligence, can help in solving this complexity?
Yeah, I'll give one example. And if we use the U.S. system, we in 2011, roughly, one of the Office of Management and Budget here in the U.S. put together this federal risk and authorization management program, and the design of it was to sort of accelerate the adoption of security cloud solutions and to improve the confidence and security of the cloud solutions. And that was adopted by the U.S. government. But then other regulations and other authorities started coming into play. So then we had the Federal Information Technology Acquisition Act of 2014. And then later on in 2014, we had another act of federal information security modernization. And then it just kept going. So from 2002 to today, there still continues to be new regulations and new laws that aren't in complete alignment with one another. And to keep up with all of them is hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars to even meet some of these standards. And likewise, to stay in compliance with them, it costs a lot of money. Not to mention all the other laws and regulations that you have to keep up with. So if you're in healthcare, you have HIPAA. If you're working in Europe, you have GDPR with privacy laws. Now Canada has their new privacy laws. In Australia, you have privacy laws as well as the modern slavery regulations that the organizations have to keep up with. So you have these myriad and these large, vast documents that you're all trying to keep up with. So if we use technology, and for us, we use the, as I said, natural language processing to take into account the context for each occurrence of a given word and go, okay, we meet these standards, we meet these laws and this policy. And as long as we meet it here, then can we meet it in all these other regulations? Can we meet it in all these other laws? And the answer is, when we put it in the policy, yes. And we can use the tracking of tech to make sure that we're meeting those laws and regulations. So instead of having a bunch of different policies and sifting through a bunch of different documents to figure it out, we're using natural language processing to take into account the context of each of those occurrences and make sure it's in our controls for that particular business. So we're pretty excited about that piece to just accelerate the ability to stay compliant.
Definitely, I think technology is obviously a welcome tool, and it should be used more and more. New blockchain technologies can also act as a remedy by monitoring the situation and securing information that law enforcement agencies need to share. Also, artificial intelligence, like you clearly pointed out, is also very beneficial. But a human judgment is still important and necessary in some cases. So, technology helps you to access the first flow of information more easily and quickly. But at some point, you cannot avoid the need to use the brain's thoughts, feelings, or even sensitivity. So we should not completely rely on automatic and virtual solutions alone to solve the problem of corruption, for example. So these are all pointed out by experts and opinions of different leaders. I would want to know that, do you think why AI should be encouraged to increase compliances to laws and regulations?
Yeah, I mean, you make a lot of great points in terms of human beings being accountable, right? And I think that is where I think we should all be in agreement is who's accountable for it, and it's definitely the human beings. Simultaneously, you mentioned the thought of regulations and having human beings take a peek at it. Yeah, I mean, us as humans still need to be able to interact with the technology, but the technology helps put the data that we collect in a form that might be easier, makes things more effective and efficient for the end user. So, not saying that technology is the end all, but definitely helps us to become more effective and more efficient. The second thing, I think, when we're talking about technology and piecing it together for accountability, would be sort of the transparency piece. And the plus for most countries that focus on computer science and math would be that when you're using these codes, when you're using this technology, you really need to understand mathematics, right? It's built on mathematics. So when people say, oh, it's too complicated, we don't know how it works, it's maybe they just don't understand the math. And so we need to dig deeper into the math piece to find transparency within the technology. And that'll give us kind of more understanding of what the technology is recommendations that it's getting, or what biases that the technology might be sensing, and make those corrections within the math.
That was quite a comprehensive answer, and thank you for sharing us certain examples as well. Now, usually, whatever we discuss about regulatory and compliance, some negative criticisms are also form the core of regulations and compliance. Now, for example, if you're talking about AI, we also know that AI can do a lot of good, but it must be mindful about AI should not be in the hands of malicious users. So as technology continues to become more powerful, AI can cause severe damage if it is used maliciously. So new technologies can exploit the vulnerability of systems that are dependent on artificial intelligence and machine learning technologies. As these AI systems get smarter, they can change the nature of threats as well, making them harder to detect, more random in appearance, more adaptive to systems and environments, and more efficient at identifying and targeting vulnerabilities in systems. Now, this is quite terrifying. Now, regulations are needed to make ethical use of AI. Like the basic of regulations is to make ethical use of any technology. Now, since we're talking about AI, so let's focus on how we're trying to make AI more ethical. But it is also to minimize the growing cyber attacks. So, what are your views on the current landscape of cybersecurity and AI?
Yeah, in terms of cybersecurity and AI, you are definitely right. I think two things: if you're pushing through regulations or you're pushing through these new standards, you're going to have to continue to adapt to them. So if you're not using automation to put these standards and controls into place, then you've lost, or in essence, you're losing the current game. In terms of cyber attacks, I think there's nothing to lose for criminals, right? They have so much to gain in terms of because they're not playing by the rules, and so at the same time, those that are playing by the rules are trying to defend and protect their information. They need to be using artificial intelligence and other technology, whether it be investing in quantum computing or investing in increasing processing speeds. All of those things, and I'm just listing a few examples here, that we need to be using to thwart off the cyber attacks. Now, as I say that, there's also the information security. And if we're not careful and we don't, as you said earlier, that people are at the heart of it, and people are the ones that are using the technology, and that's where the vulnerability lies. Who has the information, and how the hackers or those that want to take down a company, that threat, they're using sort of social engineering mostly to make some of these do some of these hacks and cyber crimes. So we need to remember that and keep that in focus, that we're using tech to make us more effective and efficient, but we also have to remember that who are we giving the information to? And I think that's where this new breed of zero trust and the new wording of zero trust is coming about, that you need to verify who you're giving the information to, and how they're going to use that information either today or later on down the road.
Definitely, I think that's one of the crucial areas that organizations should keep in mind, and of course, we need to have certain regulations again to make sure that the data is not in the wrong hands, and make sure we are effectively utilizing the data. But when you're talking about regulation, the trouble is that regulations designed to breathe life into AI dream could in fact do the opposite if not approached with care and due diligence. Regulatory compliance is an important aspect across the spectrum of business, from retail to banking or for any other industry. But it is also incredibly complicated, especially with new technologies being implemented into business models on an almost daily basis. So all of this boils down to that framing regulations again isn't an easy task. So how do you think we can overcome these challenges of framing a regulatory and compliance? Or of course, I think six clicks is one such a way, or a company that is helping us to overcome such challenges. But apart from that, are there any major aspects that probably you would like to guide our listeners?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think being able to understand the natural language processing is super. It's been super helpful, and certain processes in natural language processing doesn't meet. It's not like sometimes they use just single words generating single word representation instead of taking the whole context, which is also going to be challenging as we look at the global environment. Here in the U.S., how we think about the law and the legal system is much different than how people think about it in the United Kingdom and across the globe, right? That we're thinking about laws and regulations in different ways, and there's different contexts for that. Same goes with the sciences. So I didn't mention this earlier, but I have a chemistry degree. I started out in chemistry and then went into law, and the context and how you talk about the biology and the chemistry of things is very different in how words are used. And so training these models in the different regulations across different jurisdictions and within different industries is going to be super helpful in staying compliant. And that's where we have been focusing a lot of our effort at 6clicks, is in the context of the standards, laws, regulations, and policies that companies are using, and how do we make sense of it in a productive way to make the business more effective and more efficient throughout their life cycle. And so we're really, really excited about that at 6clicks, because we want to make it easy. We want to, and simultaneously, we haven't talked about this, but we want to make it easy. We want it to be smart as we're using it, and we want to make it cost effective. And that's kind of the differentiating factor that we've really focused on.
Glad to know that, Josh. Thank you for letting our listeners know how can we overcome these challenges. But again, I would like to circle back to probably one more challenge, is that when we're talking specifically about workplaces where we are leveraging technologies, and workplaces are day by day getting smart workplaces. So in order to rapidly improve talent management and to take full advantage of the power and potential that AI has, we need to shift our focus from developing more ethical HR systems to developing more ethical AI. So, of course, removing bias from AI is not easy. In fact, it is very hard. But our argument is based on our belief that it is far more feasible than removing it from humans themselves. So, when we're talking about ethical use of AI, we're talking about regulations and compliance that would help ensure ethical use. But I also want to know that how can we ensure that the workforce or all the employees are working towards the ethical development of AI?
Yeah, and I think this goes back to the transparency within the code itself. The beauty of seeing the code and understanding the math is you know exactly what inputs and what information is being fed into the system, fed into the algorithm. Now, if I look at you and you look at me, I don't know what you're thinking about unless you tell me. I can't do an audit on your mental models. Where within AI, within technology, within the code, we see what the inputs are, we see what the mental models are, we see the vectors being built, and we can say, well, this is stemming from this biases. And though it might be labeled a different way, it still goes back to the human. So we can't completely eliminate the bias. And I think we all have some sort of explicit or implicit bias that we as humans have. And I think if we can start having more conversations, I mean, that's probably step one, is having more conversations and being more open to conversations around folks and where they're at and how we're all in the same place. That's one aspect. The other aspect would be doing an audit on the code, and how do we think about what inputs and what mental models or what algorithms are being placed in the code. And so it's never going to be completely eliminated, but you can put in particular checkpoints or barriers or feedbacks to say, hey, this is where we're going, and kind of do that audit for a complete assurance that your code and your system or your robot is acting in a efficient and ethical way.
Absolutely. again, I would like to come back to the same point that employees also are really important in this entire process of making sure the AI is effectively used, because again, you never know that probably there are certain employees who can act a little maliciously and make sure that the data that they have, or the access to data that they have, can be used misappropriately as well. So since we're talking more about the present scenario and what all challenges we can overcome, is there any strategy? One last question for you would be, how do you think would be the future with regulations and AI?
Yeah, well, we're kind of seeing that with the European Union right now, where they're putting together their policy documents on how do we regulate algorithms, how do we regulate artificial intelligence. Here in the U.S., they're doing the same thing, where new laws, and though they haven't been passed yet, it has been thought about and it's being developed in regulating artificial intelligence. And some of the pieces that align within there might be this sort of this antitrust, the ethical biases, as we continue to mention, bias and how discrimination might work is going to be huge within these regulations. And then the other is sort of making sure, I think one piece of the regulation that everyone's talking about is making sure that we don't lose the personal workforce. That is something that a lot of people have been thinking about as well. The last piece that I'll mention here is around what is the security of artificial intelligence, and where is the data going to be going to? Who owns the data? And I think that's going to be a big piece too, around what can we do with that data? Who owns the data? And where, who's it? Like, what's the security behind that data? So privacy is that other underlying piece that everybody's always concerned about. If the computer is taking my information and making judgments, there might be a bias there. But at the same time, what is that information and who owns that information once it goes into the system? So I think those are all questions that everybody is definitely concerned with when talking about the new laws and regulations of artificial intelligence.
Absolutely. As we plow ahead into the 2020s, the only way we can realistically see AI and automation take the world of business by storm is if it is smartly regulated. This begins with incentivizing further advancements and innovations to the tech, which means regulating applications rather than the tech itself. Now, while there is a great deal of unwanted fear around AI and the potential consequences it may have for businesses and workforces, we should be optimistic about a future where AI is ethical and useful in a world where workers displaced by automation have retrained for more suitable and other value added jobs, or probably more important roles. Thank you so much, Josh, for taking out time and giving us such an insightful conversation on our podcast. It was a pleasure having you here today with us.
Thank you, Priya. I really enjoyed it, and I look forward to listening to more of your podcast, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to your listeners.
Thank you so much.